Mayday, Mayday, this is Indianapolis. Torpedoed.
Picked up a distress signal from a sinking warship. He was too drunk to do anything about it. 2 more stations picked up the same signal. One decided it was a trap. At the other, the duty officer was under orders not to be disturbed. 890 men were left in the open ocean for 4 days. What happened to them next became the largest shark attack on humans in history. But the one who ended up court-martialed wasn't the radio operator who was drunk on duty. It was the ship's captain, the only man in the history of the U.S. Navy ever tried for losing his ship in combat. 2 weeks before any of this, nobody on board had any idea what was coming.
On July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert, the world's first nuclear test, codenamed Trinity, went off. A few hours later, once word came back that the test had succeeded, the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis left San Francisco, headed west.
The secrecy around this mission was total, even by the standards of the Manhattan Project, a project so classified that Vice President Truman himself didn't know it existed until he became president. On board, a wooden crate bolted to the deck of an officer's cabin, and a metal cylinder guarded around the clock by Marines standing shifts with loaded weapons, even in the mess hall. Inside were the components of the first combat-ready atomic bomb, enriched uranium-235, and the firing mechanism for Little Boy, the bomb that would fall on Hiroshima in 3 weeks. The crew had no idea what they were carrying. Only Captain Charles McVay and 3 officers knew. Everyone else was told the cargo was classified, and that if the ship started going down, the crate had to be saved before the men. An order that at the time sounded like some grim joke from the senior staff. Nobody suspected that in less than 2 weeks, that order would become irrelevant for a completely different reason.
Indianapolis sailed alone, without escort, and set a speed record, 74.5 hours to Pearl Harbor at an average of 29 knots, faster than any ship of her class had ever made that run. The crew treated the sprint like a challenge, almost a competition with themselves, with no idea they were carrying the material for a weapon that would help end the war in 3 weeks.
From there, Tinian, a speck of an island in the Marianas, the same island the Enola Gay would take off from in 3 weeks. The cargo was delivered on July 26, 1945, and handed off under guard, straight onto the airfield tarmac. 11 days remained before the bomb fell on Hiroshima. The mission was complete. On paper, the most dangerous part of the voyage was behind them. The urgency hadn't been for show. Military planners were preparing for a massive invasion of the Japanese home islands that fall, and they were counting on this new weapon to end the war before that invasion ever had to happen. Every day of delay meant, in theory, 1 more day of war, and more casualties on both sides. Or at least that's how the handful of men who knew what was in the crate justified the urgency to themselves. From Tinian, Indianapolis moved on to Guam, then received new orders. Proceed to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines to join USS Idaho for combat training ahead of the planned invasion of Japan. A routine transfer between bases, well behind the front line. Command didn't see any need to assign a destroyer escort. The route was considered safe at this stage of the war, and there weren't enough escort ships to go around in the Pacific that summer. The crew, at least, was experienced. Indianapolis had fought through nearly the entire Pacific campaign, from the raids on the Gilbert and Marshall Islands to the battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The ship had taken hits before and always made it back into service. For many aboard, that history was reassuring. A ship that had survived that much combat didn't seem like the kind of ship that could go down on a routine transfer in the rear after the worst fighting was already behind them. Nobody on board knew that this ordinary, unremarkable stretch of water was about to become the ship's last. At that same moment, in those same waters, a Japanese submarine, I-58, was closing in for the kill. Her commander was Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, an experienced submariner, for whom the summer of 1945 meant watching the Japanese Navy reduced to a handful of submarines and a grim determination to use them until the end. By this point, U.S. Navy intelligence had decrypted enough Japanese radio traffic to know for certain that a group of Japanese submarines, including I-58, was operating along the Guam to Leyte route, the exact route Indianapolis was sailing. That warning never reached Captain McVay. Understanding policy, intelligence at that classification level went only to admirals, officers ranked above McVay, so that even a leak couldn't tip off the Japanese that their codes had been broken. McVay was steering his ship directly through waters where, according to his own Navy's intelligence, an enemy submarine was already waiting, and he had no idea. That information stayed classified for almost 50 years until the early 1990s and was never available to him or to his defense at the court-martial. Hashimoto had Kaitan aboard, manned suicide torpedoes, weapons of desperation from the war's final months. His pilots were eager to go. For many, this was the one mission they'd spent months training for. Hashimoto said no. The target was moving slow enough and straight enough to sink with a conventional torpedo spread. No need to send a man to certain death inside a guided weapon. He wouldn't explain that decision publicly for years. It also happened to save the lives of the pilots who'd been begging that night for a seat in the torpedo's cockpit. On the evening of July 29, visibility was good and the sea was calm. Under his sailing orders, McVay had discretion to zigzag or not. It was an evasive tactic meant for poor visibility, not a standing order for every condition. At 8 p.m., he decided a zigzag wasn't necessary and went to sleep in his cabin. The secret cargo had been delivered. The most dangerous leg of the voyage was, as far as he knew, behind him, and victory in the war seemed to be a matter of weeks, not months. He fell asleep a man who thought he'd already won. At 12:15 a.m. on July 30, Hashimoto caught the silhouette of a ship in his periscope, lit by moonlight. He gave the order to fire. 6 torpedoes went out, one after another, seconds apart. 2 struck Indianapolis on her starboard side. The explosions tore open the bow and ruptured the fuel tanks. Burning fuel turned the front third of the ship into a wall of fire within seconds. She began listing to starboard almost immediately, faster than the crew could react. Some of the men died in those first seconds, in engine rooms, in compartments where water and fire poured in together, in berths they never made it out of. The radio men managed to send out a distress signal several times, despite the fire and partial loss of power. Not every lifeboat could be launched. The list was too severe, and some of the davits had jammed as the hull deformed. Indianapolis sank in 12 minutes, faster than some men could make it from their bunks to the top deck. Of the 1,195 men aboard, roughly 300 died with the ship. The rest, about 890 men, were left in the open ocean, in the dark, hundreds of miles from the nearest land, many without life jackets they'd never had time to put on. some still in their underwear, jolted awake by the blast in the middle of their sleep.
Watching through his periscope, Hashimoto saw the cruiser's silhouette go bow first into the water and roll over.
"A hit! A hit!" he shouted. And by his own later account, his crew broke into something like an impromptu victory dance right there in the sub. None of them could have known that night that they hadn't just sunk another warship for the tally. They'd sunk the ship that 2 weeks earlier had delivered the components of the bomb that would change their own country and the entire course of the war in 11 days.
The men still in the water heard their home of the last several months go down. The screech of tearing metal. Then a sudden, total silence none of them would ever forget. Some, still stunned by the blast, didn't understand for the first few minutes what had even happened. Seconds ago, they'd been asleep in their own bunks, and now they were swimming in the dark through wreckage, calling out names of men they couldn't see. They were certain help was only hours away. After all, the signal had gone out.
The signal really had gone out. At least 3 shore radio stations picked it up.
At the first station, the duty officer was drunk and couldn't process the message. At the second, the commanding officer had left standing orders not to be woken under any circumstances, and the radio man didn't dare disobey. At the third, the signal was written off as a Japanese trick, an attempt to lure a rescue ship into an ambush. Fake distress calls broadcast by enemy submarines were common in the war's final months, and the officer on duty chose not to take the risk.
3 stations, 3 different reasons, the same result. The signal went unanswered.
3 separate, unconnected failures on the same night. It sounds too implausible to be coincidence, and yet that's exactly how the story was officially explained for years. A string of unlucky mistakes, not a systemic failure. None of the 3 stations knew that the other 2 had picked up the exact same signal that same night. Otherwise, even one of them might have suspected something more serious was going on.
For decades, the Navy's official position was different. The distress signal was never received at all, because the torpedoes had knocked out the ship's electrical system. That version repeated in reports, in the press, in testimony before official boards, until the late 1990s, when part of the military's archives were declassified, and historians, working independently of one another, found the logs of all 3 stations with the signal marked as received. It became clear the signal had been received 3 times and ignored 3 times. The release of those documents triggered no new investigation, no new court-martial, no official response from the Navy remotely comparable to what came down on McVay in 1945. By the time the truth surfaced, the case had long been considered closed, and a guilty party had long been named. Why reopen a question that already had an answer, even the wrong one?
None of the 3 duty officers ever faced a tribunal. None faced disciplinary action. Their names, unlike McVay's, never became part of the story retold decade after decade. The account of the drunk radio man and the order not to disturb the commander only surfaced publicly half a century after the disaster itself, after the one man officially found guilty in this story had already been dead for almost 30 years.
There was a second, quieter reason nobody went looking for the ship. Under the rules in place in 1945, a warship failing to arrive in port on schedule wasn't, by itself, considered cause for alarm. Command assumed ships changed routes without notice for security reasons. Indianapolis was due in Leyte on July 31. Her absence from port was noticed. and nothing was done about it. That practice would eventually change, but only years later, for an entirely different reason we'll get to near the end of this story. While Navy Command believed everything was proceeding as planned, 890 men in life jackets, for those who had them, drifted in the open ocean, about to spend 4 days there that survivors still debate. What was worse, the sharks or the waiting? The moment the ship went down, nearly 1,000 men were in the water. A cruiser of that class simply didn't carry enough life rafts and boats to hold the full crew by regulation. The math assumed other ships in a convoy would always be nearby. Indianapolis had been sailing alone, which meant hundreds of men were left with only a handful of rafts and floating nets, thrown overboard in the last minutes before she went under. Current and wind spread the men across the ocean within hours. Hundreds of separate groups, ranging from a few men to a couple hundred, miles apart from each other. Some ended up near the rafts and nets, though there weren't enough spots for everyone, and holding on meant clinging to rope loops on the outside rather than sitting inside. Most had nothing but their leather life jackets, which in 1945 were stuffed with capac, a plant fiber similar to cotton, light and buoyant as long as it stayed dry. Nearly everyone survived the first night. Officers among the larger groups tried to impose some kind of order, roll calls by name so nobody got lost in the dark, rationing the handful of freshwater flasks they'd found, assigning men to stay awake and listen for the sound of an aircraft engine. Men held hands, called out to each other, sang to stay awake and stay together. Many genuinely believed rescue would come by morning. The distress signal had gone out, after all, and by every calculation, search planes should have been overhead by first light. The sun rose. No rescuers came. By day, the water's surface heated up enough that skin on shoulders and faces, constantly soaked in salt water and burned by the sun, began to blister and crack. Fuel from the ruptured tanks spread a thick black film across part of the surface. Men caught in it choked on fumes, and the oil burned their eyes badly enough that many temporarily lost the ability to see clearly. That same film, ironically, would later become one of the reasons rescue planes overhead didn't spot the men right away. From the air, the dark patches on the water looked like an ordinary oil slick, not a cluster of living people. At night, the temperature dropped and hypothermia set in. Bodies already weakened by the day's heat couldn't cope with the cold. A man could cycle through both extremes in a single day, and each time, his body recovered a little less.
Thirst became the deadlier enemy before the sharks did. A person can survive several days without water, but not under constant heat, salt spray, and physical exhaustion. Some, driven half mad by thirst, drank seawater anyway, even though most sailors knew it kills faster than thirst itself. The salt breaks the body down from the inside within hours, triggering convulsions, then delirium. Men who drank seawater usually died within a day, often in the grip of that delirium.
By this point, the first sharks began to appear. Oceanic white-tip sharks stay far from shore, out in open water, exactly where Indianapolis had gone down. It's one of the few shark species that doesn't avoid people out of caution, but instead approaches out of curiosity, bumping its snout against a target as if testing whether it's worth attacking before committing. The explosions and blood in those first hours, followed by hundreds of men splashing for hours on end, drew them in from the start. Tiger sharks joined later. Attacks weren't constant. Sharks struck more often at dawn and dusk, when they could see silhouettes better against the surface,
and when the water carried the most blood from those who died overnight. Groups that stayed tight and kicked the water in unison fended off sharks noticeably better than men who swam alone or drifted from the main group, though holding a tight group together got physically harder with every passing hour.
By the third day, the Kapok life jackets, soaked through for nearly 2 days straight, began losing their buoyancy one by one. Men had to hold their own heads above water almost entirely on their own strength, and anyone who dozed off from exhaustion, even for a few minutes, risked drowning. Constant exposure to salt water ate through skin at the elbows, knees, and anywhere a jacket rubbed against the body. Wounds that would have healed in a week on land never healed at all in the ocean, and became one more thing drawing sharks in.
The third day was when delirium became just as deadly as physical exhaustion. Bodies deprived of fresh water and sleep for 2 straight days under a blazing sun started failing not just physically, but mentally. Men began hallucinating. Some saw an island nearby and swam off toward it, never to return. Others saw the ship itself, convinced Indianapolis was still afloat just a few strokes away, and burned their last strength swimming toward nothing. The most dangerous hallucination came wrapped in fear. Japanese soldiers hiding underwater, knives drawn, among their own men. Men driven mad by thirst and sun attacked whoever was nearest, their own shipmates, mistaken for the enemy. There were cases of delirious sailors drowning each other, each convinced he was defending himself. Survivors later said the worst sound wasn't the screaming during a shark attack. It was the silence afterward, when it became clear there was nobody left to look for.
The group discipline officers had tried to maintain that first night. Prayers said aloud, roll calls, order by rank, had almost entirely broken down by the end of the third day. Men who'd been encouraging each other the day before were now fighting purely for themselves, because that was all the strength they had left. The few groups where officers still managed to hold some order together, keeping the weakest from drifting off alone, watching for anyone whose speech had started slurring, ended up losing fewer men than the groups that had already scattered into individuals by the end of the second day.
For the men still lucid, the worst part wasn't the shark attack itself, but the waiting. They'd see a fin appear near a neighboring group, hear a scream, then silence, and know their group could be next. Some deliberately swam away from the wounded or the dead, because blood in the water drew sharks to anyone nearby. A cold, almost rational decision in the middle of total chaos.
By the morning of the fourth day, barely a third of the men who'd originally gone into the water were still alive. The survivors had mostly stopped talking by now. There wasn't strength left, even for words. Many lay nearly motionless on the surface, conserving every movement, staring up at an empty sky, waiting for the sound of an engine that never came. The exact number of shark deaths remains unknown. Estimates range from a few dozen to well over 100. It's considered the largest mass shark attack on humans in history. But even that number isn't the main reason. Only a little over 300 of the 890 men who went into the water on the morning of July 30 survived. Most of the dead didn't die from a shark's teeth. They died of thirst, hypothermia, and delirium, long before anyone ever came looking for them.
The rescue forces still had no idea they needed to be searching at all.
Historians and survivors alike have long wondered how many of the men lost over those 4 days could have been saved
if the search had begun on the morning of July 31, a single day after the ship went down, instead of 4. No one has ever published an official count, but the gap between the signal was received and ignored, and search teams went out the next morning, was measured not in abstract negligence, but in a very specific number of men who could have lived to see that morning, and didn't.
On August 2nd, the 4th day after the ship went down, a patrol bomber, a Lockheed Ventura, took off on a routine mission, scanning for Japanese submarines by sight. At the controls was Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn.
Flying over a stretch of open ocean, Gwynn spotted a dark patch on the surface and assumed it was an oil slick from a submarine, the usual sign patrol crews looked for. He dropped altitude to get a closer look at the source of the slick, and instead of a submarine, he saw people. 20, 30 heads in the water, waving what strength they had left, and beyond them, as far as he could see, many more.
Gwynn immediately radioed in the coordinates and called for help, circling overhead to keep the site in view. After 4 days of drift, the current made any fixed position unreliable without constant updating. Word spread across every nearby base almost instantly. Command finally realized that somewhere in the Philippine Sea, possibly more than a few dozen men, an entire missing crew, had been in the water for days.
The first to reach the area was Lieutenant Adrian Marks, flying a PBY Catalina flying boat. His orders strictly forbade landing on open ocean. The swells made a water landing extremely dangerous, and taking off again with a full load of survivors might not even be possible for that type of aircraft. Marks circled the area, watching from above as sharks picked off men isolated from the main groups, and decided that waiting for the ships, which wouldn't arrive until nightfall, would cost too many lives. He disobeyed a direct order and set down in the middle of open ocean, a maneuver his own instructors had called essentially impossible in those swells.
He pulled men aboard until there was no room left inside the plane, then began lashing the rest to the wings with rope and parachute cord, knowing it would leave the aircraft unable to take off again. By nightfall, the destroyer escort USS Cecil J. Doyle arrived on scene under the command of Lieutenant Commander Graham Claytor. Without waiting for official clearance, Claytor pointed the ship's most powerful searchlight straight up into the sky, lighting up the low clouds and turning his ship into a perfect target for any enemy submarine in the area, and kept the light on all night. For the hundreds of men still in the water, that beam in the sky was the first real proof that someone had found them. Doyle would stay on scene longer than any other rescue ship until August 8. Crews on the rescue vessels later recalled having to pull men out of the water one at a time by hand. Most were too weak to grab a lowered line on their own.
In total, 316 men were pulled from the water, out of roughly 890 who'd gone in after the ship sank 4 days earlier. Of the 1,195 men who'd sailed out on Indianapolis, only these 316 would make it home. The rescue stretched over several days. The last survivors weren't pulled from the water until August 3rd, more than 4 full days after the ship went down. Many of the men brought aboard were described by the ship's doctors as closer to dead than alive. Sunburned, coated in fuel oil, their eyes raw from salt, their bodies eaten away by the ocean, almost down to the bone.
This should have been the end of the story, but the loudest accusation to come out of this tragedy was still ahead, and it wasn't aimed at the men who ignored the distress signal.
4 months after the rescue, Captain Charles McVay was court-martialed.
He became the only commander of a combat ship in the entire history of the U.S. Navy ever tried for losing his vessel to enemy action. Over the course of the war, dozens of American ships had been sunk under similar or worse circumstances, and not one of their captains was ever brought to trial. The scale of the proceeding looked out of all proportion to what had happened. The hearings took place in Washington, under heavy press attention. The Navy had won the war just 2 weeks earlier, and a public trial of one of its own captains looked like an attempt to show that the guilty would be found and punished, whoever they turned out to be. Many officers who knew McVay personally publicly questioned whether the trial was even necessary. Almost no one in the Navy believed it would end in acquittal, and even fewer believed it should have gone to trial at all. Throughout the proceedings, the press regularly printed photographs of McVay at the defendant's table, back straight, in full dress uniform, his face unreadable. People who knew him at the time remembered him carrying himself with the same discipline he'd shown on the bridge of his ship. He never lost his composure, never raised his voice, never once publicly questioned the system trying him, even though that same system had failed to protect his own crew 4 months earlier. The charges came down to 2 counts. The first, that he'd failed to order a timely abandonment of ship. The court acquitted him on this count. The ship sank in 12 minutes, and at that angle of list, launching every lifeboat was physically impossible. The second count decided the case. The prosecutor asked directly, "Why didn't you zigzag?" McVay answered just as directly. His sailing orders left the maneuver to his discretion, and on the evening of July 29th, visibility had been good. There was no formal basis for requiring a zigzag. Everyone in the room knew that by the letter of his orders, the captain was right. That answer, not the question of evacuation, became the count he was convicted on. The defense pointed out that dozens of other captains had made the same call under similar conditions throughout the war, and none of them ever faced an inquiry, simply because their ships happened to make it safely into port. The prosecution made an unusual move. It called Mochitsura Hashimoto himself, the commander of the submarine that sank Indianapolis, to testify. It's one of the rarest moments in the history of U.S. courts-martials. An enemy commander, flown in specifically for the trial, testifying against one of his own former targets. The prosecution expected he'd confirm that a zigzag would have thrown off his aim, strengthening the case against McVay. Hashimoto said the exact opposite. From the position he'd fired, he'd have sunk the ship regardless of whether it zigzagged. The range and angle had been too favorable. The enemy captain's testimony, favorable to the defense, didn't change the outcome. McVay was found guilty and demoted 100 numbers in rank, a serious penalty by Navy standards, one that effectively ended any future career, though it stopped short of discharge. Later, Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal reviewed the case, took Hashimoto's testimony into account, and fully reversed the penalty, restoring McVay to his rank and position, calling the sentence excessive. On paper, the punishment was undone, but the conviction stayed in his record. The press had already printed thousands of stories under headlines naming the guilty captain, and the reputation of the only man in the history of the U.S. Navy officially found guilty of losing his ship was something no order from a secretary could ever fully repair. Formally lifting the penalty didn't stop what the trial had started. Every Christmas, for more than 20 years, longer than the war he'd helped win with that same ship had even lasted, Charles McVay received letters from the families of his dead sailors. They weren't making legal arguments. They were just pain, addressed to the one man they could name and blame, One letter he kept for years longer than the rest. Its author wrote that the holidays in their house would have been happier if the captain hadn't killed their son.
Meanwhile, most of the surviving crew of Indianapolis never blamed McVay at all. Many of them spent years attending the ship's reunions, specifically to be near him, publicly supported him, and would later become the driving force behind the campaign to clear his name. The weight of blame hadn't come from within the crew. It came from outside it, from the press, from Navy command, from a public that needed one specific name.
McVay retired a rear admiral. On paper, his career had been restored. But for the rest of his life, he remained the only officer whose name the press and the public associated with the deaths of roughly 880 men, even though the court had cleared him on the more serious charge, and even though hundreds of other captains made the same zigzag call every single day of the war without consequence. He rarely gave interviews, avoided a public spotlight he'd never wanted, and kept a folder of letters until the day he died. Some of them gratitude from former crewmen, others curses from strangers' families, unable either to throw them away or to stop rereading them.
In 1968, 23 years after Indianapolis went down, Charles McVay walked out onto the porch of his home in uniform and shot himself. It took 23 years for the harassment to finally break a man the court had already cleared, back in 1945, of the more serious charge.
The official exoneration that would have cleared his name completely was still 33 years away, and it would be brought about by a schoolboy who'd never served in the Navy. In 1996, an 11-year-old boy from Florida named Hunter Scott got a school assignment. Pick a historical event for a project. He chose the sinking of Indianapolis, inspired by Quint's famous monologue from Jaws. There's an irony in that. Pop culture, which had distorted this story beyond recognition, ended up becoming one of the reasons the captain's name was eventually cleared.
Scott started by interviewing a few survivors, and didn't stop there. Over the following years, he personally interviewed roughly 150 men who'd survived the disaster, and reviewed more than 800 pages of archival documents, including the declassified material on the ignored distress signals.
He presented everything he'd gathered to the U.S. Congress, pushing for a review of Captain McVay's case. By then, McVay had been dead for 28 years. The push was backed by surviving crew members who had spent decades trying to do the same thing largely alone and unnoticed, and by historians who'd been researching the archives independently of Scott.
What veterans hadn't managed to do for decades, get Congress to seriously pay attention, an 11-year-old with a history fair project pulled off in a few years. In Congress, the campaign was publicly led by Senator John Warner, a Republican from Virginia, and a former Secretary of the Navy himself, which gave the effort real political weight and secured hearings a schoolboy's case would never have reached on its own. The key piece of testimony, once again, came from Mochitsura Hashimoto, the same commander of I-58 who had already told the 1945 court-martial that a zigzag wouldn't have saved the ship. In the late 1990s, he repeated that publicly in a written statement to the U.S. Congress, personally backing the review of the case of the very man whose ship he'd sunk.
In October 2000, the U.S. Congress passed a resolution stating that McVay should be cleared of all responsibility for the loss of his ship, and President Bill Clinton signed it into law as part of the Defense Authorization Bill. In July 2001, Secretary of the Navy Gordon England signed an order formally entering that exoneration into Charles McVay's official record.
removing the last mark left by the 1945 court-martial. McVay himself never lived to see it, but his son and other relatives did.
The exoneration came 56 years after the ship went down, 33 years after the captain's suicide, and thanks to a boy who was 11 years old when he started digging into the case.
At the signing ceremony sat a small group of very elderly survivors, the same men who had spent decades showing up at reunions for their former captain. For them, the 2001 document told them nothing new. They had never needed a piece of paper from the Pentagon to know McVay wasn't guilty. The paper wasn't for them. It was for the historical record, the official version, finally catching up with what the crew had known all along.
The ship itself stayed missing even longer. For decades, its exact location on the floor of the Pacific remained unknown. The coordinates recorded at the time of the attack in 1945 turned out to be off, and several earlier expeditions came back empty-handed. The breakthrough happened not in the ocean, but in an archive. In 2016, Navy historians uncovered the deck log of a landing craft that had passed near Indianapolis 11 hours before the attack and recorded her exact course. That single entry narrowed the search area nearly fivefold, from 3,000 square miles of open ocean down to 600.
In 2017, the research vessel Petrel, owned by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, used those refined coordinates, along with modern equipment, autonomous underwater vehicles capable of mapping the ocean floor at depths no diver could ever reach.
Before that, at least 2 other expeditions had searched for the wreck over the previous decade, using the official 1945 attack coordinates, and both came back empty. Proof in itself that the coordinates recorded that night had been off by tens of miles, likely because of the chaos and urgency of the sinking, when nobody on board was thinking about precise navigation.
On August 19, 2017, the Petrel team found the wreckage of Indianapolis at a depth of more than 5,500 meters on the floor of the Philippine Sea, deeper than any diver could ever descend, reachable only by autonomous vehicles with cameras. That's almost 2 kilometers deeper than where the Titanic rests, in a darkness so complete no sunlight has ever reached it.
The screens showed the wreckage. Gun turrets scattered across the sea floor, part of the superstructure, the anchor. A ship that sank in 12 minutes had spent the next 72 years resting at that depth. For the last surviving crew members still alive to see it, all in their 90s by 2017, the discovery felt like a kind of closure to a story 72 years in the making. Not because it changed any of the facts, but because the ship they'd watched sink in the dark finally had a location on a map. It was this story, more than the sinking itself, that eventually pushed the U.S. Navy to overhaul how it tracked its own ships. After 1945, the policy changed. A ship failing to arrive in port on schedule now triggers an automatic search, instead of going unnoticed until someone happens to spot it from the air. The wreck was declared a war grave. Nothing was brought to the surface. The ship remains exactly where it sank, 72 years ago.
In 1975, Jaws hit theaters. In it, a fisherman named Quint delivers a monologue, the story of his time aboard Indianapolis and what happened to the crew in the water. Nobody quite agrees on who wrote it. By one account, one of the screenwriters came up with the idea. Then director John Milius dictated a 10-page version over the phone, and the actor, Robert Shaw, cut it in half
and rewrote it in his own voice right before the camera rolled.
Even the authorship of the film's most famous line about a true story is disputed. But the filmmakers clearly took at least as many liberties with the facts as they did with the credit. That monologue became, arguably, the most famous reference to Indianapolis for generations of viewers who never opened a history book. And almost none of it is accurate.
Quint gives the wrong date for the sinking, June 29th instead of July 30th. He gives the wrong number of men in the water, 1,100 instead of roughly 890. He claims no distress signal was ever sent, even though we now know one was sent 3 times and ignored 3 times. And one of the men who dies in his story, a sailor named Herbie Robinson from Cleveland, is a character the screenwriters invented outright.
And yet the way Robert Shaw delivered that monologue, almost no pauses, in a flat, heavy voice, like a man long past the point of being able to tell the story any other way, made the scene far more convincing than the text itself deserved. Audiences didn't remember the numbers or the dates. They remembered the tone, the sense that this was a man who'd actually been there. That's exactly why the inaccuracies spread so easily, as if they were fact. A beloved character had said them, and people wanted to believe him.
Even the piece of pop culture that kept this story alive longer than any other naval disaster of the 20th century somehow managed to get almost every important detail wrong.
So who's actually responsible for the deaths of roughly 880 men?
The captain, convicted over a maneuver that was never a direct order. The 3 duty officers who ignored a distress signal and never faced a court of any kind. Or a system in which a missing warship simply wasn't considered cause for alarm for several days.
The one man officially punished for this tragedy never made a single mistake that actually cost a life. The men whose mistakes did cost lives, 3 duty officers, a command staff that never sounded the alarm when a ship went missing, faced no punishment at all, and most of them never became part of this story by name.
Indianapolis wasn't the first ship whose loss got pinned on one man, because that was easier for the system than admitting its own failure. But it may be the case where the truth eventually caught up with the official version, just 56 years too late.
What do you think? Who's really to blame here? Leave it in the comments and see if the next person who reads it agrees with you.